They say some storms arrive without thunder, slipping in quietly beneath the daylight until the first crack of danger splits the world in two. And if you agree that some heroes hide in plain sight, then stick around, like, follow, or subscribe to hear more of the truths we often overlook. Because what happened that day inside Miller's Country Diner began with nothing more threatening than a child whispering, "Mommy, he's in trouble." It was early afternoon, sunlight pouring through the wide front windows in warm, buttery sheets that made even the chrome napkin dispensers gleam with a lazy glow, and the diner smelled of coffee, blueberry pie, and the comforting hum of a dozen conversations happening all at once. From where I sat, tucked into the back booth that Emily Hart always favored, nothing about her stood out. Not the soft gray hoodie smudged with a stain from her morning's work at the auto shop, nor the dark hair pulled into a quick, half-rushed ponytail, nor the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the kind all single mothers in their late 20s seem to wear like a quiet second skin. She was simply Emily to the world, ordinary, unassuming, unnoticed, and yet, invisible to the other diners clinking forks and rattling ice in their glasses. I could see the trace of someone else beneath her surface, a different posture, a different stillness, the kind you only keep if you've spent years expecting danger to leap from silence. Her son Aiden, bright-eyed and perpetually torn between coloring books and curiosity, sat across from her, swinging his legs under the table as if the floor were a drum only he could hear. Outside, trucks rumbled past on the highway, each one briefly shaking the diner windows like a passing heartbeat, and I could tell, even before she sensed it, that something was about to disturb the day's fragile peace. Emily had just taken a sip of coffee, black, always black, when Aiden stilled, his crayon hanging midair like a suspended drop of paint. "Mommy," he said again, this time softer, like he was afraid the walls might hear him. And that was when Emily's eyes narrowed in that precise way hers always did, a subtle brightening behind them, like a match being struck. She didn't turn immediately. Years of operating in shadows had taught her that the fastest reaction was often the most foolish. Instead, she listened, first to the diner, to make sure no other voice had triggered her son's concern, then outward, toward the bustling parking lot on the other side of the glass. That lot seemed perfectly ordinary at first glance. Sun-blanched pavement, a few scattered oil stains, a row of pickup trucks baking in the heat. But the moment I followed her gaze toward the far corner, past the rusted yellow parking barrier and the half-bent customer parking only sign, I saw what he had seen. A young man, barely college age, thin, nervous, was being shoved toward the open sliding door of a dark van. The first attacker, dressed in nondescript tactical pants and a black t-shirt, gripped the kid's collar so tightly a fistful of fabric bunched at his neck, while another man stood guard, scanning the lot behind cheap sunglasses that did nothing to hide the cold sharpness in his eyes. Two more lingered behind the van, pretending to scroll phones they weren't actually reading. 5 in total, each moving with coordinated purpose, but trying desperately to appear random to anyone who might look their way. And inside the diner, no one did. Not the tired mother juggling a toddler and a menu. Not the old couple sharing a slice of pie. Not the free construction workers hunched over their birders like the world outside didn't exist. Only Emily. Only Emily saw it. Or rather, only Emily cared enough to see. I watched her exhale once, quiet and controlled, as if she were releasing the last piece of who she was supposed to be so she could slip into the woman she used to be, the one the Navy had forged across years of brutal discipline and darker missions, the one who had kicked down steel doors in places whose names never made the news. She didn't stand abruptly or make a scene. She simply touched Aiden's hand, her voice low and even when she said, "Stay here, buddy. Keep your head down. I'll be right back." There was no fear in him, only trust. Trust built from watching his mother fix engines, patch scraped knees, and move through life with that quiet certainty reserved for people who have conquered nightmares most wouldn't dare imagine. Emily slid out of the booth with the same careful grace she once used stepping out of a submerged insertion craft, her body relaxed but ready, any hint of tension buried beneath an ocean of calm. She crossed the diner floor with the steady pace of someone heading to refill a parking meter. Nothing more. No rush, no hesitance, No hint that with each step she cataloged exits, distances, angles, and the movements of 5 men who had no idea a storm was already forming behind them. A bell over the door jingled lightly as she pushed it open, and sunlight poured over her shoulders in a warm halo that belied the cold, surgical precision awakening beneath her bones. The first attacker stepped toward the diner entrance, intending to keep watch over the van and ensure no witnesses interfered. He didn't give her more than a passing glance. That was his mistake. He saw a young mom in a hoodie, nothing else. Not the residual strength in her stride. Not the exacting awareness in her eyes. Not the training that never truly fades. And certainly not the lethal history she kept hidden behind an easy smile. The wind carried the faint scent of gasoline across the lot, mixing with the sharper smell of hot metal and the distant thrum of a semi on the highway. And in that moment, just as Emily angled toward the door where danger waited, there was a shift in the atmosphere, so small most people would have missed it. But I didn't. She didn't. The day had changed. The world had tilted. 5 men had chosen the wrong diner, the wrong parking lot, the wrong young woman sipping coffee with her son. And as Emily moved toward them, her expression calm, her voice steady in her own mind, I knew, long before the first man realized it, that they were already on borrowed time. The heat outside the diner shimmered off the pavement in wavering mirages, but there was nothing distorted about the tension coiling in the air as Emily stepped into the parking lot, her boots hitting the ground with the soft, certain thud of someone who knew exactly how far she could go if she needed to. Someone who had once measured survival in inches and heartbeats. She walked as though she belonged there, as though she were simply moving to stretch her legs or check something in her truck. But the truth pulsed beneath her calm exterior. She had already calculated the intervals between each man, the weight distribution in their stances, the distance from the van to the diner, and the number of seconds she had before one of them decided to escalate the situation. All 5 attackers were within range, close enough that she could break them down one by one if they approached in sequence, close enough that she could take them all even if they came together. But she needed them to make the first mistake. She needed their confidence to blind them a moment longer. The first man, Finn, tattooed forearms, false bravado in the way he puffed his chest, turned to block her path to the door. "Ma'am," he said, though it wasn't polite, wasn't respectful. It was a warning wrapped in a smirk. "This isn't the place for you." Emily only lifted her eyebrow. Behind him, the young kid being forced into the van struggled weakly, his voice muffled by the hand clamped over his mouth. The other attackers barely looked up, too sure of their numbers, too sure of their plan. And that was the moment, the exact second, when Emily exhaled and let go of the last remnants of her civilian posture. Her shoulders loosened, her jaw unclenched, and her eyes cooled into something sharp, something honed. She stepped to the side as if to give the tattooed man space, and when he shifted with her, just half a step, just enough, that tiny motion unlocked everything she needed. Emily moved. Not fast, not reckless, efficient. Her hand snapped to his wrist, twisting it backward with a pop that wasn't loud but was decisive, and before he could shout, she drove his face into the diner's wooden doorframe with enough controlled force to drop him instantly. His knees buckled, and he collapsed in a heap. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully at the impact, at violent odds with the sudden stillness that followed. The second attacker, hearing the thud, whipped around in startled confusion, his hand flying toward his belt for the knife she'd already noticed. Emily closed the distance before the blade cleared its sheath. She pivoted, grabbing a fistful of his shirt, and used his own momentum to flip him over her hip and straight through a nearby patio table. Plates shattered, silverware scattered like shrapnel, and the man hit the ground hard enough to rattle the window panes. Inside, a few diners gasped, finally recognizing the danger unfolding outside. Someone shouted for help. Someone else ducked. Aiden, still in the booth, didn't move, his wide eyes fixed on the doorway, trusting the way children instinctively do when they know the ground beneath them is made of bedrock, not sand. The third attacker charged her from behind, his boots pounding the asphalt in frantic, uneven beats. Emily heard him before he was fully airborne. She sensed the shift of air behind her, the grit of a shoe sliding across the pavement, the whispered intake of breath from a man who thought brute force could solve what precision could not. She didn't even turn. She dipped her shoulder, hooked his arm, and let his own momentum carry him screaming over her back before she planted him on the hood of a nearby car so violently the metal dented beneath him. He slid off with a groan. Free down. The last two froze. They had been so sure, so completely convinced, they controlled the situation. But now the landscape had changed. The young man they'd tried to abduct lay half-collapsed beside the van, forgotten by his captors. A bird cawed somewhere overhead. A distant semi hummed along the highway, and in the center of the lot stood Emily Hart, breathing evenly, eyes steady, hair fluttering in the warm breeze like she had all the time in the world. One of the remaining men, the watchman with the cheap sunglasses, took a step back. What the hell is she?" he whispered. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The fifth man drew a knife, knuckles white, fear battling machismo across his face. "You should have stayed inside," he growled, but his voice shook. "You should have minded your business." Emily tilted her head, the ghost of a smirk flickering at the corner of her mouth. "I am," she said softly. "This is exactly my business." He lunged, but Emily was already moving. She caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted, and sent the blade skittering across the pavement. She swept his legs, dropped him flat onto his back, and pinned him with her knee before he could draw another breath. The last attacker finally broke, sprinting toward the van in a blind panic. But he got only 3 steps before Emily was on him, hooking his collar and sending him crashing into the side panel with a metallic thud. And just like that, before the sirens began to echo in the distance, before the diners fully processed what they were seeing, before the young kid even knew he was safe, the parking lot fell completely silent again. Emily straightened, checked the area, and calmly zip-tied each man with the restraints they'd brought for someone else. When it was done, she brushed her hands off on her jeans and walked back inside the diner with the same composed, unhurried stride she'd walked out with. Aiden looked up at her, chocolate milk mustache on his lip. "You're really, really fast," he said. Emily kissed the top of his head. "Only when I have to be," she murmured. And outside, 5 dangerous men learned an unforgettable lesson. There are some lines you don't cross, and one of them is a SEAL mom on her day off. The squad cars arrived with a whirlwind of sirens, flashing lights, and startled officers who stepped out expecting a hostage situation or a full-blown shootout. Not 5 unconscious or groaning men neatly lined up along the curb, zip-tied, disarmed, and arranged with military precision like a tactical display. The young man they'd tried to abduct sat on the ground wrapped in a diner apron someone had handed him, shaking but alive, while Emily Hart stood off to the side with her hands casually tucked into the pockets of her hoodie, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a to-go order rather than the woman who had dismantled an entire criminal crew in under 2 minutes. The police tried to question her, but her answers were short, factual, and stripped of anything that hinted at who she had once been. She never lied. She simply didn't elaborate. She gave statements, reassured the victim, and checked on Aiden, who clung sleepily to her hand as the excitement of the afternoon faded into exhausted curiosity. The officers kept exchanging glances, because she didn't act like a frightened witness or a reckless vigilante. She acted like someone who had done this before, someone who understood violence intimately, someone who carried training beneath her skin the way others wore tattoos. Eventually, with more questions than answers, the police thanked her and promised to be in touch. Emily nodded, gathered Aiden's backpack, and drove home without fanfare, as though saving a stranger from being kidnapped was simply another item on her day's to-do list. By morning, however, everything had changed. The beating sun had barely risen when her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, and although Emily normally let unknown calls go to voicemail, something in her instincts told her to pick up. "Miss Hart," a calm but strained voice asked. "This is Mayor Daniels. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." She glanced at Aiden still curled up on the couch under a blanket, cartoons flickering silently on the TV. "A bit early for city business, isn't it?" she replied. The mayor exhaled, and the weight behind that breath told her he hadn't slept much. "We need to speak," he said. "About yesterday. About the young man you saved." His words carried a gravity that tightened the air around her. He explained, voice steady but grim, that the attackers weren't local criminals. They were part of a trafficking ring operating across 3 counties, the same ring the mayor's office and law enforcement had failed to shut down after months of pursuit. The victim was the son of one of his aides, targeted because of confidential documents the mayor's office was preparing to expose. If the kidnappers had succeeded, the entire case would have collapsed. "You didn't just stop a kidnapping," the mayor said, the respect in his voice unmistakable. "You prevented a political disaster and saved a life that mattered far beyond this town's borders." Emily didn't respond at first. Praise always sat strangely on her skin. The years she'd spent as a SEAL had taught her that the moments that defined a mission rarely needed applause. Only quiet understanding and the resolve to live with the memories afterward. "I did what anyone would have done," she finally said. "No," the mayor countered gently. "You did what almost no one could have done." And then he made the offer she never expected. You wanted her to consult for the city, not as a police officer, not as a public figure, but as someone who could analyze threats, advise on tactical risks, help protect vulnerable people, and strengthen the community from beneath the spotlight instead of inside it. "We need someone who sees what others overlook," he said. "Someone like you." Emily stared at her kitchen counter, at Aiden's cereal bowl, at the life she'd fought to build away from the noise of her past. She had left the SEALs to give her son stability, safety, a home that wasn't defined by deployments or danger. Yet the memory of that young man's terrified eyes, the helpless way he'd been dragged toward the van, tolled like a warning bell in her chest. Trouble didn't stop existing just because she stepped away from the battlefield. Sometimes it followed ordinary people into parking lots under a bright afternoon sky. "I'll think about it," she told him, and the mayor accepted that without pushing, as though he already understood she would choose the path that protected the most people. After the call ended, Aiden shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mommy," he mumbled, "are you going to help more people?" She crouched in front of him, brushing his hair back from his forehead. Her throat tightened, not because she was afraid, but because children see truths adults try to outrun. "Maybe," she said softly, "if it means keeping folks safe." Aiden nodded in the earnest way only kids can. "I think you're the bravest mom in the world." She swallowed a quiet laugh, pulling him into a hug. "I'm just your mom," she whispered. "That's what makes me brave." Later that day, as she drove into town to run errands, she passed the diner. Yellow tape still fluttered in the breeze. A news van idled across the street, the reporter speaking into a microphone about an unidentified woman who single-handedly stopped an organized abduction. Emily kept driving, the corners of her mouth lifting in a rare, quiet smile. Let them talk. Let them guess. The world didn't need to know her name. But the criminals in that holding cell did. The mayor did. And somewhere, 5 men who woke up bruised and humiliated knew, with absolute clarity, that they had crossed paths with something they would never forget. A woman forged in fire, sharpened by service, transformed by motherhood. Not a myth, not a rumor, not a ghost from some elite unit whispered about in briefing rooms, but a SEAL mom drinking coffee with her kid on an ordinary afternoon who refused to let evil steal someone else's future. And whether she accepted the mayor's offer or not, one truth had already shifted beneath the surface of the quiet little town. Emily Hart wasn't done protecting people. Not yet.